Every retired military dog in the adoption hall stopped breathing for one impossible second because a young woman whispered a Navy name that should have disappeared forever. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from today. We love seeing this community grow across America and around the world. If stories about loyalty, honor, and second chances mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe. And when this journey reaches your heart, leave a comment telling us what touched you the most. Your words help us tell even better stories for everyone who believes that faithfulness never truly dies. The old warehouse sat near the edge of Norfolk, Virginia, where salty air rolled in from the harbor before sunrise. The building had once stored naval equipment. Now its weathered beams held a different kind of silence. Rows of retired military working dogs rested inside sturdy kennels lined neatly across the concrete floor. Most were aging German shepherds whose eyes still carried the calm discipline of years spent serving beside America's finest. They were no longer young enough for active duty. Their muzzles had turned silver. Their movements had slowed. Yet there was something noble in the way each dog quietly watched every person entering the room, as though the uniform had disappeared, but the promise beneath it had never faded. Volunteers walked softly between the kennels, speaking in gentle voices while checking collars, fresh water bowls, and handwritten information cards. Prospective adopters gathered near folding tables where warm coffee filled paper cups and conversations remained respectfully quiet. Some families smiled with excitement. Others looked uncertain, wondering whether they could earn the trust of a retired military dog who had already given the best years of his life to someone else. At the far end of the building rested the largest German shepherd in the entire adoption event. His name was Atlas, 9 years old, powerful shoulders beneath a sable coat touched with gray, amber eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing almost nothing. Unlike several other dogs who occasionally accepted treats or curious hands through the kennel gate, Atlas never moved closer. He simply watched, calm, patient, distant. The volunteers respected him for that. They often whispered that Atlas had never shown fear, only waiting, and no one knew exactly what he was waiting for anymore. The adoption coordinator, Grant Holloway, stood beside a clipboard reviewing adoption paperwork. 57 years old, broad-shouldered, with kind but tired eyes, Grant had spent nearly 2 decades helping retired military dogs find peaceful homes. He believed every dog deserved one last chapter filled with quiet mornings instead of duty rosters. Still, Atlas worried him. Families admired the impressive German shepherd from across the aisle, but after meeting his unwavering gaze, most quietly chose another dog. Not because Atlas looked dangerous, because he looked like he belonged to someone who had never returned. Outside, the first rays of dawn painted soft gold across the parking lot. A gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water, old cedar, and distant rain. The heavy entrance door opened with a slow creak. Everyone glanced toward it out of simple curiosity. A young woman stepped inside alone. She wore blue jeans, worn hiking boots, and a dark green jacket pulled close against the cool Virginia morning. Around her neck hung an old pair of military dog tags resting gently against a cream-colored sweater. Her long chestnut hair moved lightly with the breeze before the door closed behind her. She could not have been older than 28. Her expression was calm, but her blue eyes carried the quiet weight of someone who had come searching for far more than a dog. No one recognized her. She signed nothing and asked no questions. She simply looked across the room as though following a memory instead of a map. Grant greeted her with a polite smile. "First time here." She returned the smile, though it barely reached her eyes. "Yes, sir." "Looking to adopt?" She paused for only a heartbeat. "I think. I am looking for someone who has been waiting longer than I have." Grant nodded kindly, assuming grief often made people speak in unusual ways. He pointed toward the kennels and invited her to take her time. She thanked him and began walking slowly down the center aisle. One by one, the retired German shepherds lifted their heads as she passed. None barked. None wagged their tails. They simply watched her with unusual stillness. Then, at the far end of the room, Atlas slowly rose to his feet. The old German shepherd had ignored dozens of visitors before, but this morning was different. His ears stood tall. His breathing changed. His amber eyes locked onto the young woman before she had even reached his kennel, as though somewhere deep inside an old promise had quietly begun to awaken. Claire Donovan continued walking without hesitation, her boots making soft echoes across the worn concrete floor while dozens of quiet eyes followed every step. She never hurried. She never reached toward the kennels the way most visitors did. Instead, she carried herself with the calm patience of someone who understood that trust could never be borrowed. It had to be earned. The old military dog tags resting against her sweater swayed gently with each movement, catching the pale morning light filtering through dusty warehouse windows. The volunteers noticed them immediately. Military families often came to these adoption events, but there was something different about the young woman. She looked less like someone searching for a companion and more like someone searching for an unfinished sentence. Atlas remained standing. His powerful frame appeared motionless, yet his ears followed every faint sound Claire made as she approached. His amber eyes never drifted toward the other visitors now wandering between the kennels. The world beyond the aisles seemed to disappear. Grant Holloway quietly folded his clipboard beneath one arm while continuing to watch from several yards away. During 19 years of working with retired military dogs, he had witnessed remarkable reunions. Former handlers recognizing old partners. Veterans finding comfort in dogs they had once trained. Families discovering companions they never expected to love. But he had never seen Atlas react this way to a stranger. "Has anyone met him before?" one volunteer whispered. Grant slowly shook his head. "Not that I know of." Claire stopped beside another German shepherd several kennels away from Atlas. The elderly dog lifted his muzzle, sniffed the air, then calmly rested his head against the kennel gate. Claire smiled warmly and crouched just enough to meet his gentle gaze. "You have served long enough," she whispered. "You deserve peaceful mornings now." The old shepherd blinked slowly, almost as though he understood every word. She stood again and continued forward, one kennel after another. Every retired working dog seemed unusually attentive. Some remained lying quietly while following her with their eyes. Others slowly stood. None barked. The silence itself became impossible to ignore. Grant finally walked toward her. "You seem comfortable around military dogs." Claire offered a polite smile. "I grew up around stories about them." "Your family served?" Grant asked. She gently touched the dog tags resting against her chest before answering. "My father did." Grant nodded with quiet respect. "Navy?" Claire's expression softened. "Yes, sir." She did not say anything more. She did not mention medals, deployments, or sacrifice. The simple answer carried enough weight on its own. Outside, gulls circled above the nearby harbor, while the scent of salt water drifted through the slightly opened warehouse doors. Inside, sunlight stretched farther across the concrete floor, warming the rows of aging kennels. Atlas had still not moved away from the front of his enclosure. Instead, he stood tall with quiet dignity, watching Claire approach one careful step at a time. There was no excitement in his posture, no anxious pacing, only complete attention. Claire finally reached the final row. For the first time, she stood directly before Atlas. The large German shepherd did not press against the gate. He simply stared into her blue eyes with a depth that unsettled everyone watching nearby. Claire slowly raised one hand, not to touch him, but to rest it lightly against the cool metal bars. Atlas stepped forward until only inches separated them. His nose lifted slightly toward the weathered dog tags around her neck. He inhaled once, slowly, carefully. Then he became perfectly still. Claire lowered her eyes to the engraved metal hanging against her sweater. One tag carried her father's name. The other bore a small navy insignia polished smooth by years of handling. She gently closed her fingers around them, took one quiet breath, and looked back into Atlas's unwavering amber eyes. Around them, every conversation inside the warehouse faded into silence. Even the volunteers seemed to sense that something impossible was about to unfold. Atlas did not blink. Claire did not look away. Somewhere deep inside memories neither of them had chosen to carry alone, an old promise waited patiently for a single forgotten name to be spoken aloud once again. Atlas never looked away. The old German shepherd stood so still that even the rise and fall of his breathing became difficult to notice. Around him, the warehouse seemed to surrender to a strange quiet. Volunteers who had spent years working with retired military dogs exchanged uncertain glances without speaking. A little boy who had been laughing near the entrance suddenly lowered his voice after noticing the unusual stillness spreading through the room. Even the gentle clinking of coffee cups seemed to fade beneath something no one could explain. Claire remained where she was, her hand still resting lightly against the kennel gate. She had imagined this moment countless times while driving across Virginia before dawn, yet reality felt strangely different. There had been no dramatic greeting, no barking, no frantic movement. Only two pairs of eyes meeting across a few inches of steel, carrying years of memories that belonged to someone else. Grant Holloway quietly stepped beside one of the longtime volunteers, Martha Lewis, who had helped place retired military dogs into loving homes for nearly 12 years. Without taking her eyes off Atlas, Martha whispered, "I have never seen him hold eye contact this long." Grant slowly nodded. "Neither have I." Martha folded her arms. "Maybe he recognizes the dog tags." Grant considered the thought before gently shaking his head. "Those tags are too far away to read. It is something else." Atlas slowly lowered his nose until it hovered just inside the kennel door. He inhaled once more, carefully drawing in the scent carried by the cool morning air. Claire noticed the tiny movement and instinctively loosened her grip on the weathered chain around her neck. The old metal tags rested against her sweater once again, softly reflecting the golden sunlight now reaching through the warehouse windows. She remembered her father polishing those same tags at the kitchen table when she was a little girl. He never spoke much while doing it. He simply rubbed each edge with a folded cloth before quietly placing them back around his neck. As a child, she once asked why they mattered so much. He smiled and answered with only one sentence. "Some names carry people home." She had never forgotten those words. Across the aisle, another retired German shepherd quietly stood inside his own kennel. Then another. Within moments, several dogs had risen to their feet without making a sound. None pulled against their leashes. None barked for attention. They simply faced the same direction as Atlas. The volunteers began noticing it one by one. "Look," someone whispered. "They are all watching her." Grant slowly walked farther down the aisle to see the full row of kennels. His expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Nearly every retired military dog now stood facing Claire. Calm, silent, waiting. He had organized hundreds of adoption events throughout his career. Military working dogs often reacted to familiar scents, familiar uniforms, even familiar voices. But he had never witnessed dozens of experienced service dogs quietly focus on one stranger at exactly the same moment. Claire remained unaware of the growing attention behind her. Her entire world had narrowed to the aging German shepherd standing only inches away. Atlas's amber eyes carried neither fear nor excitement. Instead, they held something deeper. Recognition without certainty. Hope restrained by discipline. It reminded Claire of the way her father used to pause at the front door before every deployment, memorizing the faces he loved before quietly walking away without promises he could not guarantee. She gently smiled at Atlas. "You have beautiful eyes," she whispered. He used to say the same thing about one of his partners. Atlas tilted his head ever so slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet Grant noticed it immediately. "That is new," he murmured beneath his breath. Atlas had not tilted his head toward a visitor in nearly 3 years. Claire slowly closed her eyes for one brief moment, gathering courage she had carried since leaving home. When she opened them again, the morning light rested softly across the weathered dog tags around her neck. Her fingers wrapped gently around the cold metal. She drew one quiet breath. The memory of her father's final conversation echoed clearly within her heart. He had told her there might come a day when one forgotten Navy name would mean more to an old military dog than 1,000 ordinary words. Standing before Atlas, surrounded by silent witnesses who did not yet understand what they were about to see, Claire realized that day had finally arrived. Claire's fingers tightened gently around the weathered dog tags as she drew one slow breath. The warehouse seemed to exhale with her. Not a chair scraped across the floor. No volunteer whispered another word. Even the gulls outside faded beneath the heavy stillness filling the old naval building. Atlas remained standing at the kennel door, his amber eyes fixed upon hers with unwavering patience. There was no fear in them. There was no confusion. Only the quiet discipline of a soul waiting for permission to remember. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Her father had spoken about moments like this only once, during a quiet evening on the porch of their family home when she was barely 16. He had stared toward the sunset for a long time before saying, Some names are never written on metals. They are carried inside the hearts of those who came home together. At the time, she had not understood. Today, every word returned with startling clarity. Grant Holloway quietly moved closer, careful not to interrupt whatever invisible thread had formed between the young woman and the retired military dog. Several prospective adopters had stopped browsing entirely. One elderly veteran removed his cap and held it respectfully against his chest without realizing he had done so. A volunteer who had been preparing adoption paperwork quietly lowered her pen. The room no longer felt like an adoption event. It felt like a chapel waiting for a prayer. Claire slowly looked down at the dog tags resting in her palm. The larger tag carried her father's name. The smaller one had been engraved with a simple naval emblem worn smooth after years of service. Her thumb traced its edge before she gently closed her hand again. Atlas watched every movement without blinking. His ears stood perfectly forward. His breathing remained calm, almost measured. Then Claire softly lifted her eyes and spoke for quiet words. "Commander Brooks, come home." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet the sound carried through the warehouse with astonishing clarity. Atlas froze completely. His chest stopped moving for the briefest heartbeat. Then something remarkable happened. The old German shepherd slowly lowered his head, not in fear, but in recognition. His tail did not wag wildly. His body did not leap against the kennel door. Instead, his expression softened in a way none of the volunteers had ever witnessed. Across the room, another retired German shepherd quietly stood. Then another. Within seconds, every military dog inside the warehouse faced Claire without a single bark. Their ears lifted together as though answering a command that had slept untouched for many years. A quiet gasp escaped someone near the entrance. Grant stared across the rows of kennels in disbelief. "My God," he whispered. Martha Lewis slowly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. They heard it. Atlas stepped forward until his nose rested gently against the kennel gate nearest Claire's hand. He inhaled slowly through the narrow opening, drawing in the scent of old leather, morning air, and the faded metal carried against her heart. Claire felt tears gathering before she realized she was crying. She had expected hope. She had never expected recognition. Grant carefully approached, speaking softly so as not to disturb the moment. "Miss, how do you know that name?" Claire never looked away from Atlas. "It was the only name my father answered to during certain missions," she replied quietly. "He told me that if I ever met the dogs who served beside him, I should never introduce myself first." Grant frowned gently. "Then why did you say it?" Claire smiled through tears that reflected the golden morning light. "Because he told me they would remember him before they remembered me." Atlas slowly closed his eyes for one peaceful moment while resting his forehead against the cool steel gate. Around him, every retired military dog remained standing in perfect silence. No one inside the warehouse understood exactly what they had witnessed, but every heart in the room recognized the same truth. Some promises survive long after voices go quiet. Some names never stop echoing inside those who were loved enough to carry them home. No one moved for several long seconds after Claire spoke those quiet words. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt alive. Warm morning light streamed through the tall warehouse windows, settling across rows of polished kennels and silvered muzzles like a gentle blessing. Atlas remained pressed against the gate, his forehead resting lightly on the cool metal while his amber eyes never left Claire. Around him, every retired military dog continued standing in complete stillness. There were no sharp commands, no restless barking, only the quiet discipline that years of service had etched into faithful hearts. Grant Holloway slowly removed his reading glasses and slipped them into his shirt pocket. He had spent nearly 20 years helping retired military working dogs begin new lives with loving families. He believed he had seen every kind of reunion imaginable. Yet nothing in those decades had prepared him for this moment. He looked toward Claire with respectful curiosity. "Would you come with me for a minute?" he asked softly. Claire nodded, though her eyes lingered on Atlas before she reluctantly stepped away from the kennel. Atlas watched her leave without making a sound. His ears remained lifted, following every footstep until she disappeared into the small office overlooking the warehouse floor. Grant quietly closed the office door behind them. The room smelled faintly of old paper, cedar shelves, and freshly brewed coffee. Framed photographs covered one wall, showing smiling military handlers standing beside German shepherds at different stages of their careers. Claire studied them silently until one particular photograph caught her attention. A much younger Atlas stood proudly beside a broad-shouldered Navy SEAL wearing dark sunglasses and a neatly trimmed beard. The man's face was partially turned away from the camera, but Claire recognized the familiar posture immediately. Her breath caught. She stepped closer without speaking. Grant noticed her expression. "You know him?" Claire slowly reached toward the frame, stopping just before her fingertips touched the glass. "That is my father." Grant looked at the photograph again before turning back toward her. "Daniel Brooks." Claire nodded. "Commander Daniel Brooks." Grant released a slow breath. "I should have realized sooner." He carefully opened a weathered filing cabinet tucked beneath the window and searched through several neatly labeled folders. After a quiet moment, he removed one thick envelope sealed with faded navy blue tape. Dust rested across its surface, telling its own story of forgotten years. Grant gently brushed it away before placing the envelope on the desk. Written neatly across the front were only 4 words. "If someone comes asking." Claire stared at the handwriting. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. She recognized every letter. Her father always crossed the capital T with a long, deliberate stroke that extended farther than necessary. As a little girl, she had often tried copying it while practicing her homework. Grant folded his hands respectfully. "This envelope arrived here almost 8 years ago." Claire looked up in surprise. 8 years. He nodded. "Your father brought Atlas here for a routine retirement evaluation shortly before another assignment. He asked me to keep this sealed unless someone came looking for the dog with more than curiosity." Claire gently rested her fingertips on the envelope without opening it. "Did he ever come back?" Grant lowered his eyes. "No." Neither of them spoke for several moments. Beyond the office window, Atlas remained standing exactly where Claire had left him, watching the closed door with patient loyalty. Grant quietly continued. "He told me something before he left." Claire looked toward him. "He said that if the right person ever spoke his Navy name, Atlas would know before any human possibly could." Claire closed her eyes as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She realized her father had never been asking the dog to remember him. He had been trusting the dog to recognize the one person he hoped would someday finish the promise he could no longer keep. Outside the office, Atlas slowly lowered himself onto the floor for the first time since Claire had entered the warehouse. He rested peacefully, his gaze still fixed upon the office door, as though he already knew that something hidden for many years was finally about to come home. Claire carefully broke the faded navy blue seal, her hands trembling just enough to reveal how much the moment mattered. The envelope had aged with quiet dignity, its edges softened by years of waiting. Yet the paper inside remained neatly folded as though Commander Daniel Brooks had expected someone to open it tomorrow instead of 8 years later. The office fell silent except for the distant hum of the old warehouse ventilation system and the muffled sounds of volunteers continuing their work beyond the closed door. Warm morning light drifted across the desk, illuminating the familiar handwriting that immediately carried Claire back to childhood evenings spent watching her father write birthday cards, grocery lists, and short notes before deployments. She unfolded the first page slowly. The ink had faded slightly, but every word remained clear. "If you are reading this, then someone I trusted has found Atlas before time erased the promise. If that someone is my daughter, then I need you to know that the bravest partner I ever served beside never wore my uniform." Claire pressed her lips together as tears quietly gathered. Grant respectfully turned his gaze toward the window, allowing her privacy without leaving the room. She continued reading. "People will tell you that military dogs follow commands. That is only part of the truth. The best ones follow character. Atlas never obeyed because he had to. He stayed because he chose to. There is a difference, and that difference saved more lives than any medal ever could." Claire remembered the countless evenings her father had returned home carrying the scent of salt air and pine, kneeling beside her before sitting quietly on the porch steps. He rarely spoke about work. When she asked difficult questions, he would simply smile and scratch behind the ears of the family dog before changing the subject. Looking back now, she realized he had not been hiding the truth. He had been protecting it. She unfolded the second page. A small photograph slipped onto the desk. It showed a younger Atlas sitting proudly beside Commander Brooks near the shoreline at Naval Station Norfolk. The sun was setting behind them, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. Atlas looked younger, stronger, but the eyes were unmistakable. Calm, steady, faithful. Claire gently picked up the photograph and smiled through quiet tears. "I have never seen this one," she whispered. Grant nodded softly. "Neither had I." She continued reading. "If Atlas recognizes you before anyone else does, trust him. Dogs remember the parts of us we sometimes lose ourselves. He will know whether your heart carries kindness long before another person can see it." Claire lowered the letter for a moment and looked through the office window. Atlas remained lying peacefully outside, his head resting between his front paws, yet his gaze remained fixed upon the office door. He had not wandered. He had not grown restless. It was as though he already understood that the waiting was almost over. Grant quietly cleared his throat. "There is one more thing your father left." He reached into the envelope and carefully removed a small leather notebook no larger than his hand. Its corners were worn smooth, and a faded navy anchor had been embossed into the cover. Claire accepted it carefully. When she opened the first page, she found short handwritten entries, each dated over several years. None described missions or operations. Instead, every page recorded something Atlas had done. One entry read, "Atlas refused to leave an injured teammate until sunrise." Another simply said, "He knew I was afraid before I admitted it." Claire turned another page and found the final entry. It was only one sentence long. "If Claire ever meets Atlas, tell her she does not have to carry my silence anymore." She closed the notebook slowly against her chest as a gentle breeze rattled the office window. Outside, Atlas finally rose to his feet, not with urgency, but with peaceful certainty. The waiting that had begun years earlier was finally reaching its end, and somewhere beyond the warehouse walls, the morning sun climbed higher above the Virginia coastline, shining upon two faithful hearts that had finally found the road leading home. Claire held the small leather notebook against her heart for a long moment before carefully placing it back inside the weathered envelope. She did not want the first thing Atlas saw when she stepped outside to be tears. She wanted him to see the quiet strength her father had always hoped she would carry. Grant gently opened the office door without saying a word. The familiar sounds of the warehouse returned little by little. Soft footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. A volunteer refilled stainless steel water bowls. Somewhere near the entrance, an old clock ticked steadily toward another ordinary hour. Yet nothing inside the building felt ordinary anymore. As Claire stepped back into the long center aisle, every retired military dog remained exactly where they had been moments earlier. Some sat calmly inside their kennels. Others stood with patient dignity. None barked. None pulled at their leashes. The peaceful silence itself had become the language they all seemed to understand. Atlas rose the instant Claire appeared. He did not rush forward or paw impatiently at the kennel door. Instead, he stood tall with quiet confidence, his amber eyes following her every step as she walked toward him. There was no uncertainty in his expression now, only recognition that had finally found its answer. Claire stopped in front of the kennel once again. This time she smiled without forcing herself. The sadness was still there, but it had been joined by something warmer. Hope. She reached into the envelope and carefully removed the small photograph of her father sitting beside a younger Atlas at sunset. Holding it gently between both hands, she turned it toward the kennel. "I thought you might want to see this too," she whispered. Atlas slowly leaned closer. His nose hovered just above the worn photograph without touching it. He breathed in quietly, then looked back into Claire's eyes. The movement was small, yet it carried years of memory within it. Grant watched from several feet away, hardly believing what he was witnessing. Martha quietly joined him. "Has he ever acted like this before?" she whispered. Grant answered without taking his eyes off Atlas. "Not once." Martha folded her hands together. "It feels like he has been waiting for her all along." Grant nodded slowly. "I think he has." Claire carefully slid the photograph back into the envelope before resting one hand against the kennel gate again. Atlas gently moved closer until only the steel bars separated them. For the first time, he lifted one broad paw and rested it quietly against the lower section of the gate. There was no scratching, no demand to come out. It was simply a patient gesture, almost as though he were asking permission rather than requesting freedom. Claire slowly lowered her own hand until her fingertips rested against the metal opposite his paw. Steel remained between them, yet somehow the distance no longer felt real. Warm sunlight continued pouring through the warehouse windows, bathing Atlas's silvered muzzle in soft gold. Claire noticed the gray around his face more clearly now. Years had changed him, just as they had changed everyone who had served beside her father. Yet his eyes still carried remarkable steadiness. They reminded her of childhood mornings when Commander Brooks would kneel beside her before leaving home, smiling with calm confidence even during uncertain seasons. He had always believed that true courage looked quiet from the outside. Atlas seemed to understand that lesson better than anyone. Grant stepped forward carrying a ring of keys. He paused beside the kennel, looking first at Atlas and then at Claire. Normally we spend days introducing retired military dogs to prospective families, he said gently. Slow meetings, careful evaluations, time to build trust. He looked back toward Atlas, whose gaze never left Claire. I have a feeling those introductions may have happened years ago. Claire swallowed softly. Only through stories. Grant smiled. Sometimes stories are enough. He slowly selected one small brass key from the ring and rested his hand on the kennel latch. Before unlocking it, he looked toward Atlas. The old German shepherd remained perfectly calm, waiting with the same patient discipline that had guided him throughout his years of service. Grant took a quiet breath, turned the key, and heard the soft click that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The kennel door opened with nothing more than the soft sound of metal releasing from metal. Nobody rushed forward. Grant stepped back first, leaving a clear path between Atlas and Claire. The old German shepherd remained exactly where he was, standing quietly inside the kennel as though waiting for one final permission that no human being besides Claire could give. The warehouse fell silent once again. Families who had arrived hoping to adopt a retired military dog now stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking. Even the youngest children seemed to understand they were witnessing something deeply personal. Claire looked into Atlas's amber eyes and slowly lowered herself onto one knee. She made no sudden movement. She stretched out an open hand, palm relaxed, fingers resting naturally against the concrete floor. You do not have to choose me, she whispered softly. You already spent your life choosing someone else. I only came to tell you that he kept every promise he could. Atlas watched her for several long seconds. His breathing remained slow and steady. Then, with the same calm dignity that had defined him since dawn, he took one careful step beyond the kennel. Another followed. The old German shepherd crossed the threshold without hesitation, not as a dog escaping confinement, but as a faithful partner completing the final step of a journey that had begun years before. When he reached Claire, he lowered his head until his muzzle rested gently against the weathered dog tags hanging from her neck. He did not sniff frantically. He simply remained there, eyes closed, breathing quietly. Claire felt the warmth of his breath through the cool morning air and gently placed one trembling hand beneath his jaw. Atlas neither flinched nor pulled away. Around them, several volunteers quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Martha turned toward Grant and whispered, I have never seen him allow anyone to touch him first. Grant smiled softly. He did not meet a stranger today. Claire slowly ran her fingers through the thick sable fur beneath Atlas's neck. The coat had become slightly coarser with age, yet it still carried the strength of a working dog who had served with unwavering loyalty. She remembered another sentence from her father's notebook. Atlas always knew when someone touched him with gratitude instead of expectation. She finally understood what he meant. Her hand held no demand, only thanks. Atlas slowly lifted his head and looked into her eyes again. Then, in one gentle motion, he leaned the side of his face against her shoulder. Claire closed her eyes as quiet tears rolled down her cheeks. She had spent years believing she had come searching for one of her father's partners. Instead, it felt as though one of her father's oldest friends had found her. The warehouse remained perfectly still. Even the other retired German shepherds appeared unusually peaceful, many now lying comfortably inside their kennels, as though some invisible tension had finally disappeared. Grant quietly approached with a simple leather lead in his hand. He stopped beside Claire, but did not immediately offer it. Instead, he looked toward Atlas. The old German shepherd glanced briefly at the lead before calmly returning his attention to Claire. Grant smiled and lowered the strap. I do not think he needs this right now, he said. Claire smiled through her tears. Neither do I. Atlas remained beside her without attempting to wander anywhere else. He simply matched her breathing, calm and steady, like two people sitting together after years apart with nothing left to prove. Grant gently handed Claire the weathered envelope and the small leather journal. These belong with both of you now, he said quietly. Claire accepted them with careful hands. As she rose to her feet, Atlas stood beside her without command, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Warm sunlight filled the warehouse completely now, chasing away the last traces of dawn. The old building no longer felt like a place where retired military dogs waited to be chosen. It felt like a place where an unfinished promise had finally found its way home, one quiet step at a time. The drive home began beneath a sky washed clean by the gentle morning breeze rolling in from the Chesapeake Bay. Claire guided her aging pickup truck along the quiet two-lane highway, while golden sunlight stretched across fields of tall grass shimmering beneath the early autumn light. Atlas rested calmly in the passenger seat without needing encouragement. He did not pace. He did not watch every passing vehicle with the alert intensity of a working dog waiting for another assignment. Instead, he sat close enough that one broad shoulder lightly touched Claire whenever the road curved through the countryside. The old leather notebook rested safely inside the center console, while the weathered envelope lay folded beside it, carrying words that no longer felt heavy with grief. They felt like directions leading home. For several miles, neither of them made a sound. Claire occasionally glanced toward Atlas, smiling each time she noticed him quietly studying the changing landscape through the open window. The cool air carried the scent of pine, fresh earth, and distant salt water. It reminded her of camping trips with her father many years earlier when he would wake before sunrise, build a small fire for coffee, and sit beside the family dog without saying a single unnecessary word. She used to believe silence meant sadness. Now she understood that silence could also mean peace. Atlas slowly lifted his nose into the breeze, breathing deeply as though recognizing familiar scents carried across the Virginia countryside. His silvered muzzle caught the warm sunlight, revealing the quiet dignity that only time could carve into a faithful companion. Claire reached across the console and gently rested her hand against his shoulder. "You do not have to be on duty anymore," she whispered. "You are family now." Atlas turned toward her with calm amber eyes and gave one slow sweep of his tail against the truck's seat before settling comfortably once again. It was the smallest movement, yet it carried more trust than words ever could. An hour later, they arrived at a modest white farmhouse resting near the edge of a wooded hillside. The front porch overlooked a quiet meadow where oak trees scattered long shadows across the grass. It had belonged to Claire's grandparents before becoming her home after her father's passing. She stepped from the truck and opened the passenger door without calling Atlas. He climbed down at his own steady pace, paused beside the driveway, and quietly looked across the property. There were no fences lined with kennels, no training fields, no command posts, only wind moving gently through the trees, birds singing from weathered branches, and the peaceful rhythm of an ordinary home. Claire watched him carefully, wondering whether he would feel lost without constant purpose. Instead, Atlas walked slowly onto the porch, circled once beneath the morning sun, and rested near the old wooden rocking chair where Commander Brooks had often sat drinking coffee before deployments. Claire felt a quiet chill run through her. No one had ever shown Atlas that spot. She climbed the porch steps and gently placed the weathered photograph beside the rocking chair for a moment. Atlas looked at it, then lifted his eyes toward the distant tree line where sunlight filtered through the pines. His posture softened in a way Claire had not seen before. It was not the posture of a soldier waiting for orders. It was the posture of someone who had finally reached the place he had been searching for all along. Claire opened the front door and quietly carried the envelope and notebook inside. When she returned a few moments later, she found Atlas lying peacefully beneath the warm morning light, his breathing slow and untroubled. The breeze stirred the fallen leaves around the porch, while the old rocking chair moved almost imperceptibly, nudged by nothing more than the gentle wind. Claire sat beside Atlas on the weathered wooden floorboards and looked toward the endless blue sky above the trees. For the first time in many years, the house no longer felt incomplete. It felt as though one faithful promise had crossed the final mile and quietly found its way home. The first week passed with the quiet rhythm of ordinary mornings, and Claire slowly discovered that Atlas measured time very differently from most dogs. He woke before sunrise every day without fail, walking silently onto the porch just as the eastern sky began to glow above the rolling Virginia hills. He never barked at the deer crossing the meadow. He never chased the rabbits darting through the tall grass. Instead, he simply sat facing the horizon, watching the first lights spread across the trees with calm, unwavering patience. Claire often joined him with a warm mug of coffee wrapped between both hands. They rarely spoke. Somehow silence had become their shared language. The farmhouse no longer echoed with loneliness. It breathed again. One crisp morning, she opened the small leather notebook while Atlas rested beside the old rocking chair. The pages carried dozens of brief entries written in her father's careful hand. None described heroics or recognition. Instead, they told simple stories. One page recalled how Atlas refused to eat until every member of the team had returned safely to camp after a difficult patrol. Another described the dog quietly placing his head on a young sailor's knee after receiving difficult news from home. Claire smiled softly as she read. Her father had not remembered Atlas because of extraordinary missions. He remembered him because kindness had survived even in extraordinary places. She reached the final pages and noticed a folded sheet tucked carefully between them. It was not a letter. It was a simple list written in dark blue ink. Across the top her father had written, "Things Atlas loves." Claire laughed quietly through unexpected tears. Morning walks before sunrise. Fresh creek water. Sitting beside someone drinking coffee. The smell of cedar wood. After rain. Country music played softly from an old radio. She looked toward Atlas in surprise. At that exact moment the German shepherd lifted his head as though sensing her attention. Claire stood, walked into the kitchen, and found the dusty portable radio that had belonged to her father. After replacing the batteries, she turned the volume very low until an old country melody drifted gently across the porch. Atlas slowly closed his eyes. His breathing deepened. A peaceful expression settled across his silvered face, unlike anything Claire had seen before. She realized she was not introducing him to something new. She was returning something he had quietly missed. Later that afternoon, a neighbor named Helen Foster stopped by carrying a homemade peach pie. She had known Commander Brooks for years and had watched Claire grow up. Helen smiled warmly when she noticed Atlas lying peacefully beneath the porch swing. "So this must be the famous partner your father always talked about," she said softly. Atlas calmly stood and walked toward her. Claire watched carefully, wondering whether he would remain distant with strangers. Instead, Atlas politely lowered his head as Helen gently scratched behind one ear. "He still remembers good people," Helen whispered. Claire smiled. "I think he always will." As autumn days passed, more neighbors stopped by with fresh vegetables, warm casseroles, and quiet stories about her father. Atlas greeted each visitor with calm dignity, never overly excited, never fearful. He seemed to understand that these people carried pieces of Commander Brooks home with them. One cool evening, Claire carried her father's old rocking chair from the shed back onto the porch after repairing its loose wooden runners. She placed it beside her own chair and quietly sat watching the sunset. Atlas walked over, circled once, and rested his head gently against the empty rocking chair before lying down between both seats. Claire looked toward the fading orange sky and finally understood something her father had tried to teach her all those years. Love did not disappear when someone was gone. Sometimes it simply waited patiently inside familiar places until another faithful heart was ready to receive it again. As October settled gently across the Virginia countryside, the farmhouse slowly became more than a place to live. It became a place where forgotten pieces of two lives quietly found each other again. Every morning followed the same peaceful rhythm. Claire brewed fresh coffee before sunrise while Atlas stepped onto the porch to greet the first light spilling over the distant hills. The old German shepherd no longer searched every horizon with the careful vigilance of an active military dog. Instead, he watched the sun rise the way an old sailor watches calm water after surviving many storms. There was gratitude in the stillness. One Saturday morning, the local Veterans Association invited Claire to attend a small community gathering at the town park. Families brought homemade food. Children played beneath tall maple trees, and several retired service members gathered beneath a large American flag gently moving in the cool autumn breeze. Claire almost declined the invitation. Crowds had never felt comfortable after losing her father. But she remembered something written inside the notebook. Healing grows stronger when it is shared. She looked toward Atlas resting beside the front door. "Would you like to come?" she asked with a smile. Atlas immediately stood, his tail making one slow sweep across the wooden floor before calmly following her to the truck. The town welcomed him with quiet respect. Some veterans recognized the careful posture of an experienced military working dog the moment he stepped onto the grass. They did not rush toward him or overwhelm him with attention. Instead, many simply nodded in appreciation, understanding that service leaves lasting marks even when they cannot be seen. An elderly Marine named Walter Simmons slowly approached Claire carrying a faded baseball cap embroidered with the words United States Navy. His weathered face brightened when he noticed Atlas. "Beautiful shepherd," he said softly. "Mind if I say hello?" Claire looked toward Atlas instead of answering herself. The old dog calmly walked forward, sniffed Walter's hand once, then gently leaned against his leg. Walter smiled through moist eyes. "That is trust," he whispered. "You cannot train that. You can only earn it." Throughout the afternoon, Atlas quietly moved among the veterans, offering silent companionship wherever it seemed needed most. One man who rarely spoke during community events found himself smiling while resting a hand across Atlas's broad shoulders. Another veteran quietly admitted that he had not touched a military dog since leaving active duty many years earlier. Claire watched from a nearby picnic table and slowly realized that Atlas was still serving. His mission had simply changed. He was no longer protecting people from danger. He was helping protect them from loneliness. As the gathering ended, a young boy no older than 8 walked carefully toward Atlas, holding a small American flag he had received during the ceremony. He hesitated several feet away before looking at Claire. "May I thank him?" he asked politely. Claire nodded. The boy stepped forward and gently placed the little flag beside Atlas's front paws. "Thank you for helping our heroes," he whispered. Atlas lowered his head, sniffed the flag softly, then looked up at the child with warm amber eyes. The boy smiled so brightly that several adults quietly wiped tears from their faces. Driving home beneath the orange glow of late afternoon, Claire reached across the seat and gently scratched behind Atlas's ears. "Dad was right," she said quietly. "You always knew where you were needed." Atlas rested his head comfortably beside her arm, peaceful and content. Beyond the windshield, the familiar road stretched toward the farmhouse waiting among the trees, and for the first time since losing her father, Claire realized she was no longer driving back to a house filled with memories. She was driving home to a life that was slowly, patiently, learning how to hope again. Winter arrived quietly across the Virginia countryside, laying a thin blanket of frost across the meadow beyond the farmhouse, while the first rays of morning sunlight painted the fields in soft shades of gold. Months had passed since Atlas crossed the threshold of the old adoption kennel, yet every new day continued to reveal another small miracle hidden inside ordinary moments. Claire no longer measured healing by the absence of sorrow. She measured it by the return of simple joys she once believed were gone forever. The farmhouse kitchen filled once again with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee before sunrise. The old radio played softly from the corner counter while Atlas rested peacefully on the braided rug near the back door, his ears lifting only when he heard Claire humming melodies her father used to whistle while making breakfast. Some memories had once carried unbearable weight. Now they carried warmth. One snowy afternoon, Claire decided to organize the cedar chest that had remained untouched in the upstairs bedroom since Commander Brooks passed away. Atlas climbed the stairs behind her at his own unhurried pace and quietly settled beside the open chest as she carefully unfolded old uniforms, handwritten holiday cards, faded family photographs, and carefully preserved newspaper clippings. Beneath a neatly folded navy blanket, she discovered a small wooden box wrapped in blue cloth. Inside rested a polished brass nameplate that once hung outside her father's office. Beside it lay a second brass plate, smaller and slightly worn. It read only one word: Atlas. Claire smiled gently as she lifted it into the afternoon light. "He made one for you too," she whispered. Atlas slowly stood and walked closer, touching the edge of the wooden box with the tip of his nose before looking back toward her with calm amber eyes. There was no excitement, only quiet recognition. Later that evening, Claire carried both brass nameplates onto the porch. She carefully mounted her father's above the front doorway where it had once belonged years earlier. Beneath it, she placed Atlas's smaller plate beside the porch entrance, not as decoration but as a simple acknowledgement that the faithful German Shepherd had always been part of the family, even before she fully understood it herself. When she stepped back to admire them, Atlas quietly took his place beneath his own nameplate and looked out across the snowy pasture. The wind moved gently through the pine trees while distant church bells echoed from the nearby town. Claire sat beside him beneath a thick wool blanket, opening the leather notebook one more time. Between its final pages, she noticed a sentence she had somehow overlooked before, written so lightly it almost disappeared into the paper. Home is not the place where service ends. Home is the place where love finally rests. She closed the notebook slowly and leaned against the old rocking chair. Tears filled her eyes once again, but they no longer came from loss. They came from gratitude. Atlas rested his head gently across her boots exactly as he had done countless times beside Commander Brooks years earlier. The gesture needed no explanation. It simply said, without words, that neither of them had to carry the past alone anymore. Above them, the evening sky slowly filled with brilliant stars, each one shining quietly against the deep blue winter night. The farmhouse windows glowed with warm light. Laughter from neighbors drifted faintly across the fields after a community supper, and for the first time in many years the old home felt complete. Not because every wound had disappeared, but because love had finally found enough room to live beside every memory. Spring returned to the Virginia countryside with gentle rain, fresh green fields, and mornings filled with birdsong drifting through the open windows of the old farmhouse. Time continued its quiet work, not by erasing the past, but by teaching every memory how to live beside hope. Claire no longer woke each day carrying only the weight of loss. She woke to the familiar sound of Atlas stretching across the wooden porch before sunrise, waiting patiently beside the rocking chair where Commander Brooks had once greeted every new morning. The faithful German Shepherd had grown older. More silver had appeared across his muzzle, and his steps had become slower. Yet there was a peaceful light in his amber eyes that had never existed inside the auction warehouse. He was no longer waiting for someone who might never return. He had already found home. On one bright Saturday morning, Claire placed a small wooden sign at the entrance of the farmhouse. It simply read, "Welcome home." Beneath those words hung the two weathered navy dog tags beside Atlas's polished brass nameplate. Neighbors stopped to admire them. Veterans quietly removed their caps before walking through the gate. Families brought retired service members to visit, not because the farmhouse was famous, but because peace seemed to live there. Atlas greeted every visitor with calm dignity, reminding everyone that courage could grow old without ever losing its kindness. Inside the house, Claire framed the photograph of her father sitting beside a younger Atlas beneath the evening sky at Naval Station Norfolk. She placed it above the fireplace where morning sunlight touched it every day. Nearby rested the small leather notebook, now open to the final page. She no longer needed to read it often because every lesson written there had already become part of her life. Sometimes, during quiet evenings, Claire would sit on the porch while Atlas rested beside her, watching the last light disappear beyond the trees. She often imagined her father smiling somewhere beyond the horizon, knowing that the promise he had carried for so many years had never been forgotten. It had simply waited for the right heart to complete it. Looking back, the greatest miracle had never been that a retired military dog recognized one forgotten Navy name. The true miracle was that loyalty survived long enough for love to answer it. A faithful daughter found the companion her father trusted most. A retired German Shepherd found the family he never truly lost. And a quiet farmhouse became living proof that some promises are stronger than time itself. We often believe extraordinary stories end with celebrations, medals, or applause. But the most meaningful ones usually end much more quietly. They end with a porch at sunrise, two empty coffee mugs, an old rocking chair gently moving in the breeze, a weathered pair of dog tags catching the morning light, and a loyal German Shepherd finally sleeping without waiting for another command. Because sometimes the bravest soul in the room is not the one who speaks. It is the one who never stopped keeping a promise. As this story comes to a close, what part touched your heart the most? Was it the forgotten Navy name, the letter left by a loving father, or the silent devotion of Atlas that never faded through the years? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your stories inspire us to continue creating heartfelt journeys like this one. And if you believe loyalty, compassion, and hope still matter in today's world, please subscribe and join us for more unforgettable stories. Until we meet again, may every promise you keep lead someone safely home, and may every dawn remind you that love never truly leaves the hearts that choose to remember.